Hello, and welcome to this lecture on population, cities, and the environment. This is a fun one. So here I've got a screenshot of city Google image search results. What do you see in this screenshot of the Google image search result for city? You see skylines. You see tall buildings. You see what we typically think of at the macro level of a city, right? We're not zoomed down into the city. We don't know what's going on in the city. But whatever it is, it's led to these big booming skylines, beautiful buildings. Presumably there's lots of business and work going on there. But this is your Google image search for city. Let's try environment. This is the opposite of the Google image search for city. This is pure nature, right? It's trees, it's all green, it's fields, there's some animals, and there's a lot of this sort of like caretaking motif where people are holding the earth or the soil in their hands. But this is very different than the previous image. It's almost like cities and environments are opposed. Like you can't have both at the same time. When you think about a city, when we saw the city images earlier, there were no trees, there was no environment, there was no physical or natural environment. And when we see these images of an environment, there is no trace of humans here at all, except the human hands that seem to be caretaking, right? There's no buildings, there's no people. In fact, there's a bird, and there's something, if I squint, it looks like a unicorn, but I'm not sure what it is. So think about our relationship between, or the relationship between cities and environments, between society and environments and human behavior. This is the crux of environmental sociology. I want to start thinking about environmental sociology with the tragedy of the commons. This is something that many of you have no doubt heard of. Some of you may be familiar with what this is. There's a really well-known paper published in 1968 in Nature by, I forget his first name, somebody Hardin, but he developed this metaphor for resource use, for the use of finite resources by a society or by any group of people. And this is not a new idea by Hardin. He's simply publishing and refining the metaphor that has existed that explains how people exploit natural resources or exploit finite resources, each to their own individual gain, but to the detriment of all. So Hardin, like Malthus, who we'll talk about later, was concerned with population growth, particularly through reproduction. So he actually said that the number one threat to population growth, the number one threat to environmental degradation was overpopulation, was people having too many kids. The idea of the commons is that, you can imagine his original metaphor here, is that of farmers in a pasture. Imagine you are a farmer in a pasture and you have a cow, and you want your cow to be able to graze in the pasture. Well, no problem. You've got a giant pasture, there's plenty of grass, lots of space. You can have your cow. Well, your one cow is doing really well. Maybe you'll add a second cow. Great, but the other farmers over there also are thinking about adding a second cow. This is fine. You add a third cow, you add a fourth cow. Eventually it starts to become a bit dense, a bit overpopulated. Maybe if you keep doing this, the grass gets eaten altogether and it doesn't have time to regrow. Your cattle start grazing at a barren field, and all of a sudden there's no land for everybody to use. The land is there, but it has been degraded, it's been exploited because everyone has been acting in their own self-interest, and now everyone has to pay the consequences for everyone using it too much. So when we all maximize the use of a resource, we individually benefit. We get the use of the thing, but we collectively suffer the costs of overexploiting that resource. The resource becomes depleted. So my comic here, everyone's sitting in traffic, and each person who's sitting in traffic, and you know you're guilty of this, each person sitting in traffic says, if these idiots would just take the bus, I would be home by now. Think about the roads as the commons. Any shared resource can be thought of as the commons, and the tragedy is that we overuse it, we overexploit it, we act in our personal interest, and we all suffer the consequences eventually. So the key here is that access to the commons is free and it's unregulated and there's unrestricted demand, and that ultimately it diminishes the resource. The benefit for exploitation is on the micro level. We may all become reliant on this part of the commons. So are you reliant on the roads? Probably, because there is no public transportation infrastructure here. We are reliant on the commons of the road, so everyone sort of has to use it, so everyone decides they're going to buy a car. But the costs of exploitation are borne by all of those to whom the resource is available. We all get stuck in traffic because everyone decides to buy a car, because we need to use the roads to go places. According to the law of supply and demand, then we need more of the resource to meet increased demand. So we need more roads. We need wider roads. This accelerates until the resource collapses, or you can't go anywhere without getting stuck in traffic. Welcome to Atlanta. So in short, this is the global threat that we face with non-renewable energy on our planet and all sorts of other resources: air, land, water, oil, coal, all of that stuff. So let's think about an example here. Hardin was concerned with population control, right? He said that the way to fix this problem was to stop having so many kids. That would decrease demand, right? Decrease access, decrease demand to the commons. Well, there's a really interesting case study here, and you can think about lots of other ways that we enact population control. Most of you do it voluntarily through subscribing to some sort of family planning program, whether it's birth control, whether it's just thinking about how many kids you want and not just having kids willy-nilly. These are cultural ideas. So you're all familiar with the one-child policy in China. This no longer exists. Now actually there's a two-child policy. And actually for much of the time during the one-child policy, it was a two-child policy for a lot of people, rural people. And before the one-child policy, actually, for about a decade, there was also a two-child policy. So there's been some sort of like limits on childbirth in China for at least 50 years. And that was the result of a huge population boom in the country. After the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, there was actually, China's fertility rate fell in half in the early 1960s due to mass starvation and migration to urban centers, this huge industrialization of the nation. And after that, people got busy having kids and the population exploded. The birth rate went up to like six kids for every woman on average. But China's one-child policy was created as a solution to overpopulation issues. There was a huge fine if you had more than one child. This was strictly enforced in urban areas, and in rural areas you were generally allowed a second child if the first one was a girl, but not if the first one was a boy. So you can think about what this means about the relative value of boys and girls in Chinese society. Because male children are more prized in Chinese culture, the policy has led over its time to the abandonment, murder, abortion, infanticide of female children at much higher rates than male children. Because if you're going to have one kid and males are more valuable, you want that boy. Families who were allowed to have only one child felt like having a female would lower the family's status. This is a really common thing. And so it led to lots of girls who were born being given away. So adoption centers and orphanages were overwhelmed with girls. This day, right, in 2021, there are actually about 34 million more men than women in China. Why? Because girls were unwanted for several decades. Were given away, were aborted. So there's way more men in China now, and this leads to all sorts of other new population problems. I mentioned the orphanages that are overcrowded with girls, and many American families adopt Chinese girls. Millions of men, 34 million more men in China than women, adults. Those men will never marry, right? Or will never marry a woman. And since same-sex marriages are pretty much banned in China, they're not going to marry a man either. From 2015 to 2016, the government started to phase out the one-child policy, and in 2016, that new two-child policy that I mentioned was passed. Because thanks to the old one-child policy, China is now a rapidly aging society. they are going to suffer severe consequences because all of the few children that have been born, the relatively few children that have been born during the decades of low birth rates, of low fertility rates, are not reproducing enough to sustain the growth of the population. And so, like many other countries, the United States included, China's population is going to start aging significantly. And there's still a sex ratio among new births. Male to female births, the ratio is about 114 males to every 100 females. So this is sort of like, if you think about the tragedy of the commons, where every new baby is sort of like an individual or a couple, acting individualistically, acting according to their own desires to use part of the resources that exist. Well, if you get the whole country having as many babies as they want, this goes for any country, right? You're going to have problems with overpopulation. So China tried to solve this problem by population control, and it ultimately was a failed attempt because there are ramifications to the one-child policy, to only having one child, whether it's in terms of gender imbalances in the country or now the aging population. So you can ask yourself why Hardin sees breeding or the population problem as the most pressing problem of the commons. There's a really good movie on Amazon called One Child Nation. I recommend you watch it. It adds a lot more nuance and gives you more information about the policy that existed. So I would ask you at this point, I guess, how many kids are you planning on having? The answer that you give to this reflects something about, perhaps, how you think about the commons. Many people give an argument for having fewer children as, I don't want to add more additional strain to the limited resources of the earth. That's one reason, and the environmental reason. And this is people thinking about the earth as a commons and thinking about population as simply something that can negatively affect our shared quality of life, the shared amount of resources that we have. So demography, or the one-child policy that I mentioned, is an example of demography in action, assessing the one-child policy, the two-child policy, and their effects on population growth, the composition, distribution, and other related changes is an example of demography at work. That's all demography is, the study of populations. Demographers and sociologists oftentimes are demographers, and the other way around as well. If you're studying demography, you're looking at rates, you're looking at numbers, you're looking very quantitatively at populations. So you might look at the fertility rate, which is the number of children born to every woman in a society on average, the mortality rate, which is the number of people who are dying per number of the population every year, infant mortality rate, how many infants, how many babies die as a ratio of the population every year, maternal mortality, life expectancy, which is how long you can expect to live given being born in a certain year. The life expectancy of the United States right now on average, it's like 78 or 79 years. And it's not the same for every population, right? For every group in American society. So Asian Americans have the highest life expectancy of any racial or ethnic group in American society. Rich people obviously have longer life expectancies than poor people, and it can be a huge difference. So all this stuff we've been talking about earlier in the class, when we were looking at social inequalities, race, gender, social class, these categories all reflect demographic patterns, or rather they all have demographic patterns that you can analyze regarding the categories. Women outlive men on average by 4 or 5 years in the United States. There's all sorts of reasons for this. Go back and look in the chapter on gender and sexuality for a refresher. And there's a lot of other things that demographers look at. Immigration with an I, how many people coming into the country. Emigration with an E, how many people are exiting the country. That's how you can remember that if you need to know. Immigration with an I is in, immigration with an E is exit, right? E, exit. Internal migration, demographers are interested in looking at how people move around within countries. There's a lot of other things too. Okay, so one key thing to note here at this point is that the global population has exploded since the Industrial Revolution, especially in the past century. It's kind of hard to imagine how unpopulated the world was in recent times. It certainly feels very populated now, not just because we hear about population issues all the time, but the amount of space taken up by people is phenomenal compared to how it was even in the recent past. I'll guide you through this sort of experiment here. If you tell me, I wonder if you know, how many people are alive in the world today, the whole world? What's the global population? Jeopardy music here. If you said around 7.5 to 8 billion, you are correct. There's 7.8 billion people in the world today. How about when you were born? If you're a traditional freshman, let's say you were born around 2000, turn of the last century, you can check it out. Follow the link to the BBC World at 7 Billion calculator. You can enter your birthday to see exactly how many people were alive when you were born. But if you were born in around 2000, there were 5.7 billion people alive when you were born. That means in the time that you've been alive, mere 20 years or so, the global population has increased by 2 billion. What is 2 billion of 5.7? How much is that? Seems like a lot. 2 divided by 5.7, 35%. The global population has increased by 1/3 in your lifetime. How about when your parents were born? Maybe about 3.7 billion. That's for 1970. If your parents were born in 1975, it was 4 billion. If they're a little older, born in 1965, it was 3.3 billion. So in your parents' lifetime, the global population has increased from 3.7 to 7.8 billion. It's doubled. There were half as many people alive when your parents were born than now. What about when your grandparents were born? Go back one more generation. We're down to 2 billion. This is roughly 1950, 1940. It was 2.5 billion in 1950. So let's say 1940, 1945, whenever it was 2 billion, your grandparents, the global population was 25% of what it is today. That's how fast the population has increased. Here's a chart showing you, and if you go all the way back, this just starts at about the year 1050. If you go all the way back to the beginning of human civilization, it just gets closer and closer to that zero line. It's not until the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s that the population really starts to take off. There are lots of reasons for that. Better healthcare, better quality of life for a lot of people in general, higher education, rise of democracy, all sorts of stuff. Think about your kids, if you're going to have kids later. When your kids are going to be born, what's the global population going to be? They might be born into a world over 8 billion people, maybe even 9 billion people, who knows. So when we talk about population, this is the sort of unprecedented change we're talking about. You're living through a period in history that no one ever has lived anything close to. Now, along with this rapid growth of human population comes thinkers, and we're going to go back a couple hundred years, thinkers who foresaw this as problematic. And we started today off by talking about the tragedy of the commons and Hardin's notion of population as a threat to the commons, as a threat to the well-being of the commons. The first person to really put this into words, to really write about this, was a guy named Thomas Malthus in the late 18th century. He wrote an essay, widely published, widely read, influenced Darwin, influenced Herbert Spencer, who's an early sociologist, influenced a lot of people who were thinking evolutionarily back in the 19th century, called an essay on the principle of population. And he said a few things. He said, one, that population increase is limited by means of subsistence. So the population can only grow according to as much food as there is. You can't outgrow your food supply. If there's no food, you can't grow the population. Population increases as subsistence increases. So the more food that there is, the more the population can increase. You can think about the little bunny rabbits out in your garden or something like that, or the population of deer. Anything that's often considered a nuisance. It's a nuisance because they have food to eat, right? If you destroy their food supply, they tend to dwindle in numbers. So he saw, well, we'll get to this point in a second. So population increases alongside food supply. Now, Malthus also said that population is kept to match the level of means of subsistence by, quote, misery and vice, famine, war, disease. These things are sort of like natural checks on population growth. They're called positive checks. Not positive, I don't know why he said positive exactly. It doesn't seem like they're good, like war isn't good, disease isn't good. But they're positive checks on population growth. So famine, war, and disease, they check the population growth. But there are things that we can do as a society that also check population growth. These are called preventive checks. So we purposely prevent the population from growing as fast as it could. These things could be like decreasing the birth rate, right? Introducing birth control. This is a preventive check that decreases the population rate. Malthus was an interesting guy. He sort of like Hardin, he suggested that people stop having so many kids to decrease the population, to lower the fertility rate, lower the birth rate. But he took a moral perspective on it, not like a tragedy of the commons moral perspective, but like, you know, the moral perspective that you might expect from a white guy in 1798. You know, you should just stop having so much sex. You need to have restraint in your sexual activity, limit the population growth. And he especially said that poor people needed to have restraint in their sexual activity. We need less poor people having so many kids. That's the real problem, according to Malthus. But he wasn't so heavy-handed. He also advocated for social welfare for the lower classes to achieve a middle-class lifestyle and to take on middle-class values, which would reduce the number of kids that they had. So Malthus said that food supply increases geometrically while food production increases linearly. But opposite. That population increases geometrically while food production increases linearly. So he didn't anticipate, you know, the rise of the Green Revolution or the Blue Revolution in agriculture and fishing. So he thought that the food supply just increased like a line, like a diagonal line. But the population would increase exponentially until it crossed the threshold of its limit of food supply, at which point positive checks would bring the population crashing back down. Right? So if your population outstrips the food supply, then you will necessarily have famine because you will have too many more people than can eat all the food. You will have war because you will have people who need limited resources and they will fight over it. And you will have disease. So great disaster and suffering will happen to sort of bring the population back in check. And again, this is called a Malthusian catastrophe. And he was certain that this would happen. Now, that was way back in the day. There are people today who pretty much still agree with what Malthus said. Of course, we had many advances and still have many advances in farming and agriculture, in medical technology. People live way longer than they did in the past. Food, we know, does not increase linearly. We can also increase food exponentially. And so there's a lot of sort of like tweaks to Malthus's original proposition. But they believe that Malthus was fundamentally right about population and food supply, that those are the main factors, that food supply is the main factor in checking the population. They do understand that other factors will affect birth rates in populations. But ultimately, regardless of all these other factors, we're still going to outstrip the planet's ability to support our ever-increasing numbers, which will, in the end, also lead, regardless, to Malthusian catastrophe. You can think about some of these other factors, but I've got a video for you to watch here. So I'm going to ask you to pause this video, my lecture video, go to YouTube and Google, go to YouTube and search for human population through time and check this video out. There's a couple different versions. You can also click this link here if you're looking at the PowerPoint at worldpopulationhistory.org. Very interesting interactive map. But this shows you visually over time population growth across the world using little dots to represent 1 million people per dot. It also shows you major advancements or major milestones throughout human history, such as you can see here the birth of Islam, the developments of trade along the Silk Road, there are various other sorts of things like the height of the Mayan civilization is on here. But it's striking to think about population being rather close to zero throughout the entirety of human history until the last few hundred years, at which point it accelerates and exponentially rises to the almost 8 billion that we have now. This video is awesome. Please go watch it. If you watched and you saw the part about the Black Death, this is a really interesting part of the video. It's probably my favorite part, because very rarely throughout human history has population declined, global population declined. The Black Death was one of those times. It killed, well, I want to say it killed something like 30% of the population of Europe. You can check me on that number, but it killed a huge number of people, and not just in Europe. We typically think about it in Europe, but the Black Death spread throughout the Middle East and into Asia as well, and killed many people. And so when you get to this part, that part of the video, right, you saw the number tick down. There's some other times when the number ticked down as well. During the Mongolian invasions, Genghis Khan, he and his armies killed so many people that the global population dipped. Another time when it dipped was during the Crusades. The same thing, European Christians going and killing Middle Eastern Muslims. During the Crusades, the population dips as well. But you can see, you can think about more recently some other positive checks, right? And those are all positive checks: war and plague, or war and famine, disease. Positive checks that decrease the birth rate or fertility rate and that increase the mortality rate, that keep the population in check. It's not that we had outstripped our food supply, it's that positive checks happen regardless of food supply as well. But interestingly, the Black Death, for example, in part was so bad because people lived in very dense urban centers, and this is where the Black Death really ravaged countries the worst. They went into the countryside as well. But other positive checks would be like during the 1918 to 1920 flu pandemic that killed approximately 50 to 100 million people. That's 3 to 5% of the world's population at that time. If you look at graphs of birth rates, the birth rate dips for a few years there. It also dips during the World Wars, or rather it doesn't dip, it slowly declines over the 20s, 30s, and 40s until the World Wars are over, and then after World War II we have what? The baby boomers, and that fertility rate shoots up after the 1940s. But during the Great Depression you also have a slowing in population growth. During World War II, when 11 million Jews and other people were killed, other people on all sides of the war were killed. It was about 50 to 85 million people, about 3% of the world's population. So there's a lot of interesting instances that you can see effects of the population growth based on positive checks. The one I mentioned earlier as well, the Great Leap Forward in China. This was before the Cultural Revolution, right during the Cultural Revolution. And environmental disasters all came together to kill about 45 million Chinese people in 1957, late 50s, early 60s. The Chinese birth rate at that time decreased by half. Now, you've got Malthus, you've got the Neo-Malthusians, who say essentially the same thing is going to happen. As Malthus said, there'll be a Malthusian catastrophe. But it'll be offset a bit because we have advanced technology and whatnot. And there's all sorts of social factors, other sorts of preventive checks that decrease the birth rate. Now, the anti-Malthusians, they are more concerned about the population shrinking. They're not concerned about us outstripping our food supply because they definitely believe in the power of science to fix our problems, right? So to fix our problems, rather, of the lack of food supply that we might run into. So we had the Green Revolution. Farming practices expanded, development of industrial agriculture. The Blue Revolution as well, same sort of thing in the oceans. It led to overfishing, actually, and lots of fishing stocks have been depleted around the world. Another example of the tragedy of the commons, right? We all want to fish in the ocean, but in many places, fish have been depleted from the ocean because too many people decided they wanted to fish, and there was deregulation, and so places were overfished, and now nobody can fish. Tragedy of the commons. The Anti-Malthusians argue that Malthus could not have known, and he couldn't have known, of medical advances, the increase in life expectancy, family planning initiatives, all those technological advances in food production. They argue instead that the population will drop because of actually a decreasing fertility rate and because of technological and agricultural advancements. This is called a demographic freefall, right? The population falls, the numbers fall, the birth rate falls, everything falls. Demographic freefall, and it becomes sort of a cycle, it perpetuates itself, such that once it starts, it's hard to stop, sort of hard to get off that train. This is where preventive checks, the falling birth rate, fertility rate, will cause their own problems. My example of the consequences of the one-child policy in China is an excellent example of demographic freefall, the beginning of demographic freefall. China will see this come to play out in the next decades. And many of us in many other countries, including the United States, will also see this come to play out in the coming decades. One reason for demographic freefall, well, you have to think about all of the reasons why the birth rate declines, why fertility rates decline. One reason is that children in the modern world are more of an economic liability than an asset. They're assets, of course, you can addition to your family and all the things that you love about your kids, but children are expensive. Childcare costs more now than ever. So I got some statistics here that are about a decade old. You can look up more recent ones. But according to Pew Research, the USDA, and a nonprofit, Childcare Aware America, the cost to raise a child born in 2011, to raise it, so that's to 18, is approximately $235,000. The cost to send an infant to daycare is higher than many in-state college tuition fees in many states. So you can think about all the other things that are expensive about raising a kid. People don't have that kind of money, right? Not everybody has that kind of money. That's one reason that the fertility rate has declined, right? People make conscious choices about what to do with their limited resources and more often choose not to have children or to delay having children until they have the resources to do so. Think about what other trends tend toward fewer children. The biggest one, the overarching trend about why the birth rate is falling, is because women are more empowered. As women become more empowered, higher educated, are given more choices by society to go out and do more things to expand the gender role, they tend to make choices that shrink families, right? They tend not to want 6 or 8 kids. So rising education among women, the later age of marriage and childbearing, more life choices and more opportunities, so less constraining gender roles. All of these lead to lower fertility rates in societies. Because medicine and healthcare have gotten better, children have better health outcomes. So if you have a kid today, it's pretty likely they're gonna live, right? They're not gonna die as infants. Back in the day, that wasn't the case. You would have many children and expect some of them to live to adulthood and expect some of them to die. So you don't need as many kids to offset the ones that will die. I said that children become an economic liability rather than an asset. By asset, what I really mean is that in the past, children were labor. You had kids so that you could earn more money. You had kids and they would contribute to the household. These days, kids don't work. We've got all sorts of labor laws. They're not supposed to work. They're supposed to have childhoods and adolescences, and they really don't become adults until, you could argue, that young adulthood, that adolescence even has extended through college. Oftentimes, many kids, many teenagers, many college graduates return home to live with their parents after college. This is a phenomenon that you see more and more compared to in the past. And partly, again, you have a cause for this is because things are expensive. And children returning to live at home after college aren't starting families and having relationships and having kids. They're usually trying to work and make money and get money to move out of their parents' house. So again, this delayed entry into marriage, delayed entry into having children. The aging population also reduces the fertility rate, right? If your parents are elderly and need care, you are less likely to have your own children because you are busy taking care of your parents, your aging parents. Children need to care for their parents. There's not time for kids too, or money for kids too. There's a whole generation called the sandwich generation. It's sort of one way to think about people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even 30s, but a little bit older now, having to take care of their parents who are living longer and require care, but also taking care of their own children. They're sandwiched between two caretaking generations. There's some really good resources here for exploring the fertility rate, the trends in the declining fertility rate. And that's not just in the US, but pretty much globally. Check out ourworldindata.org. And if you have the PowerPoint, this link here, ourworldindata.org/fertility-rate is really good here. So you can see visually, these are called population pyramids. This is a visualization of how age is distributed among populations in a society or in a country. The case here is for a population that has gone through a demographic transition. A demographic transition is when the birth rate and the death rate essentially reverse. Back in the day, the death rate was offset by the birth rate, right? There were so many new births, and that there were also so many deaths that you always had a larger number of people being born coming into the world than people going out of the world. That reverses today. So in Japan here, this is like the best global example. You can see in 1950 on the left-hand side that the Japanese population pyramid looked like the name. It looked like a pyramid. It looks like a tree, right? You have very few people who are very old, and an increasing number of people on the younger end of the pyramid. Now, as all of those young people move into adulthood and enter their childbearing years, if the fertility rate is low, then relatively few of them may have children. And so you get this middle one in 2005. That bulge in the middle around between like 40 and 60, those are the people who are at the bottom of the left-hand population pyramid. Now what happens? Why is the pyramid getting skinnier toward the younger end? Well, the fertility rate dropped to below replacement levels. What that means, replacement level is like 2.2 or something. That's the amount of children per woman to replace everyone who is dying in a population. It's got to be more than 2 because you assume that some people die and don't make it to adulthood, to childbearing years. So it's higher than 2. But Japanese birth rate is below that. And so by the time you forecast out to 2050, that population pyramid now looks like a kite. It's inverted. So you've got an aging population, lots of older people, and very few younger people. You can see the percentages on the right-hand set of population pyramids. People who were 65 and older were 4.9% of the population in 1950, By 2050, they're projecting it'll be about 40% of the population. So you've got 40% of the population who's 65 and older. That's like retirement age, right? And you have about 50% of the population who needs to take care of 40% of the population. Actually, who needs to take care of the other 50% because that other 8.6% is children, and they need caretaking too. So half the population is taking care of half the population. And the majority of those people are old. So this fundamentally restructures all sorts of things about how society functions. This is a challenge for the economy. The kinds of jobs that are available will shift, especially toward healthcare for the elderly. Changes in the labor force, healthcare, welfare. Think about how Social Security will be taxed, how pensions will be taxed. I don't mean taxed like money taken from the government, I mean stressed, right? So think about all this. Think about the Malthusian theorem. Where do you fall here? Are you like a Neo-Malthusian? Are you an Anti-Malthusian? Are you somewhere in between? What do you think is going to happen? We have projections, but we don't exactly know how population will continue to change. Demographers can predict it based on current trends, but the trends change, right? It could be that we are entering truly a demographic freefall across the globe. A lot of it depends on how countries in the global south with higher birth rates and higher fertility rates continue to develop. Right, so if we're thinking about a lot of countries in Africa or South Asia that have the highest fertility rates, if, for example, if women in those countries are able to be empowered more along the lines of how women in Western countries have been empowered since the women's movement, those fertility rates may decline significantly. But if women do not gain education in those places, it's likely that fertility rates will not go down too much, and we may not see a huge change in the global fertility rate. So there's all sorts of other things to consider as well. But think about it. I wonder what you think. So clearly, there are demographic trends that affect cities and the environment and every other sort of relationship here, right? There are environmental conditions that affect demographic trends in cities. There are trends in urban development that affect the environment and that affect demographic trends. So go back to the beginning of the lecture. What do you think about when you think of the city? What do you think of when you think of the environment or of nature? What do you think about when you think of problems relating to the city or to the environment? The key point here that I want you to take away from the rest of this lecture is that environmental sociology as a subfield of sociology looks at the relationship between human societies and the natural environment. You can't analyze society, you cannot do sociology without considering this relationship. The textbook chapter begins with a cool story. Maybe you don't think it's cool, I think it's a cool story. But it begins with a cool story of a guy named Christopher McCandless. His story is the basis of a really well-known book/movie called Into the Wild. And this is the inspiration for a lot of people to pack up all their things, sell all their things, and just like go live out in the woods and just go into nature, whether they're going to stay there permanently or whether to become more interested at all. But I'll read you the little blurb here. This is the blurb for the book. And I highly recommend the book. The movie's pretty good too. In April 1992, a young man from a well-to-do family hitchhiked to Alaska and walked alone into the wilderness north of Mount McKinley in Alaska. His name was Christopher Johnson McCandless. He had given $25,000 in savings to charity, abandoned his car and most of his possessions, burned all the cash in his wallet, and invented a new life for himself. 4 months later, his decomposed body was found by a moose hunter. Spoiler, it's in the van on the picture. So the one on the right is another book. It's one I'm currently reading for an environmental sociology class that I'm teaching. It's called A Walk in the Woods. This is an account of walking the Appalachian Trail, which goes up the eastern, the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States, all the way from Georgia to Maine. You can actually walk part of the Appalachian Trail in Georgia. It's not too far, maybe an hour and a half north. Go up to Springer Mountain or Blood Mountain and do one of those hikes. actually on the beginning of the trail. But Bill Bryson, who's the author, he recounts his experience hiking this trail with a friend of his. And it's interesting to think about these two stories, Into the Wild and A Walk in the Woods. They both offer perspectives on our human relationship with nature. They offer perspectives on our relationship with the physical environment and the relationship between social structures, physical environments, and human behavior. So many people ask, like, why in the world would someone do any of these things? Why would you go into the wilderness in Alaska by yourself? Why would you hike a trail that is a couple thousand miles long, that takes like 6 months to do? Why would you do these things? Well, because people have different relationships to nature. People have different meanings for nature. The one on the left speaks to many people who kind of want to get away from whatever they perceive as negative about life in a society, in a city perhaps. Right? Being out in the woods is really the opposite of being in a city, as we saw at the beginning of lecture with the Google image search results. Buildings versus greenery. A lot of people think about going into the woods and they think about like the bear that's on the picture of the Walk in the Woods book. Right? They think about encountering animals, whether it's a scary thing or a not so scary thing. It might be a beautiful thing. It might be a kind of communing with nature sort of thing. So there are lots of different reasons why people might do something like this, and I encourage you to check out these two books. Many of us want to experience nature, especially authentically. Many people don't want to experience nature authentically. Many people like the commodified versions of nature that we have shown to us. I really like this thing that I found. I don't even remember what I was searching, but I found this on Amazon. Hungry Bear Attack Simulator 3D. Right? This is a commodified version of nature that I wouldn't mind experiencing. Commodified, right? I don't want an actual grizzly bear encounter or hungry bear encounter, but I'll take one in virtual reality, I guess. I don't ever want to see a bear this close in real life. But it's interesting, this picture, I think, right? You've got this this woman, I guess she's in 3D or something, but she's in a city, right? And the bear is actually in the city, and actually that bear looks like it has like 18 toes. But the bear is in the city, and so you have this like merger with nature and an urban environment and this like typical kind of, I guess, city dweller person. Many of us live in suburban areas or urban areas, and we don't get to experience nature as we think about it as a pristine thing untouched by humans, although that may be the ideal. Have you ever thought about when you have gone maybe to like a state park or a national park or some sort of a landmark, and you go to this beautiful landmark and you see on the way a lot of like garish tourist attractions that have been built nearby. Like a lot of national parks are like this. In the United States, they have nearby town with attractions. They'll have a Ripley's Believe It or Not or a Hard Rock Cafe and all sorts of restaurants and things for you to eat at. And a lot of these places you can go to like an IMAX movie of visiting the place that you're about to visit, right? You can go see it on the screen before you actually go into it. So there's this sort of striking juxtaposition of the urban and the rural, the man-made and the natural, the tackiness of it and the beauty of it all at the same time. Our historical relationship with nature, though, is not necessarily one where the two are indistinguishable, is not necessarily one where nature is commodified and packaged and sold back to us. Rather, our historical relationship with nature is one of domination, driven along by industrial production and consumption. You see the little comic here. This is how I want you to frame the rest of this lecture, at least as a start. And that is to frame it in terms of what's called the treadmill of production. The treadmill of production. This is a theoretical perspective, a critical theoretical perspective on consumption, capitalism, and environmental degradation. So the idea from an environmental perspective is that the treadmill of production and consumption spurs environmental degradation, right? It makes it worse, it exacerbates it. So here in the image, you have a worker on a treadmill, right? This is you and me, regular people. We're on a treadmill. This is sort of individualized it. So you and I are on a treadmill. We are continually walking, right? We're doing our work for the benefit of attaining a wage, so we're doing this for money. With that money, we are going to buy things, right? This person wants a motorcycle and a car and a boat, right? You want things, and it's motivating you to work, to buy the things with the money. All those things must be produced. So as demand increases, more and more things are produced. This is our background. We've got this factory spouting off pollution or whatever, right? So the more things that people want, the more demand there is for things, the more we are encouraged to walk the treadmill, to consume goods, the more things must be produced. And this benefits people who are producing the things, right? It benefits capitalists. It benefits people who own companies and corporations. The government benefits as well, because as you are laboring on the treadmill, they're collecting taxes from you. So this benefits the government, it benefits corporations, it benefits you in terms of you get to buy things. But what it doesn't benefit is the environment. That is definitely the entity that is harmed by this, if we were going to talk about objective harm, right? The environment is degraded because of the treadmill of production. And it's not just you, the individual, who's on the treadmill of production. Rather, the capitalist, the corporate owner, the government, they're also on the treadmill of production. They can't get off either. So as an example, I was reading recently about forests in the United States and deforestation and logging for that environmental sociology class. Did you know, interestingly, that forest cover, the amount of the United States that is covered in forest, has decreased by about 30% since the 1600s, when settlers really started arriving here. Most of it was clear-cut for agricultural development in the 1800s. But like 30%. We used to have over a billion, like 1.1 billion, I don't know what measurement they use, hectares, I guess, or whatever measurement of forest, right, covering in the US, and that's been decreased significantly. Why? Well, clear cut for agriculture, for food production, for growing things, because we need things, right? And the more things that we grow, the more supply we have, the more things we can consume, because there's stuff to consume. The more stuff we consume, the more we're able to produce, the more we need to produce. This is sort of cycle, right? So the treadmill of production throughout the 20th century created a massive scale of industrial waste throughout the middle of the 20th century. This created a need for regulating the treadmill, right? Regulating the polluters, people who are polluting, whether it's corporate or government or whatever, people who are polluting the environment, people as well, individuals too, throwing trash out the windows and things like that. So this regulation came in the form largely of the environmental rights movement from a grassroots perspective, from the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, from a government perspective. The EPA did things early on in the 60s and 70s, like get the Clean Air Act passed, so we have clean air that's free of pollution. The Clean Water Act, so that we have clean drinking water and we don't get poisoned from our water. The EPA is in charge of regulating all of these things, making sure that people aren't polluting so that we can enjoy the air and the water, these parts of the commons. This is ever more difficult to do from a treadmill of production perspective, because the more the treadmill goes, the more things we need to produce. The more we produce, the more we degrade the environment. The more we degrade the environment, the harder it is to regulate the degradation of the environment. This is an example, the treadmill of production is an example of human exceptionalism. This is the idea that we are special, that we can control nature, that we can dominate nature, the earth, we can use it for our own purposes, we can bend it to our will. And crucially, that any ill effects that arise out of this, we can use our superior brains and technology to fix those problems. In reality, technology is a double-edged sword. Almost every benefit that we derive, every solution that we have, oftentimes creates some other unintended consequence. Whether it's damming a river and then all of a sudden you have a massive mosquito problem and dengue fever and malaria in Egypt, whatever it is, our technological solutions oftentimes create problems that can be worse than the original problem they intended to solve. You can think of many examples of this. So keep this notion of the treadmill of production in mind. There are a couple other ways I want you to think about our relationship with the environment. One is by using a concept called naturework. This is a symbolic interactionist concept, so micro-sociological, having to do with the meanings that we attach to things. Now, we work all the time to attach meaning to the natural world, to the physical world. We filter these meanings through culture. We learn these meanings. These meanings can change. We act toward the natural world based on the meanings that we hold, all this sort of stuff. So here I've got a picture of someone throwing a plastic bottle out of their car window. How do you feel about this? You might think that this is wrong. This might anger you, right? You shouldn't throw trash out of your car window. If you think this is wrong, then why do you think this is wrong? Why is it wrong to throw trash out of the window? Why shouldn't you litter? There's a lot of reasons you might have for that. It could be that littering ruins the natural environment, right? This person looks like they're driving in a pretty pristine space. Looks like they're driving maybe even down a gravel road or something. But you might think that littering ruins the environment around you. If that's the case, then you must feel some kind of way about the environment around you, that it should be free from litter, should be clean. You might ask how you define litter, right? Is litter only something that's human-made? Can litter be natural? What happens if you throw a banana peel or an apple core out of the window? Is that littering? You might justify that it is not, because those are natural things. They came from the earth. They're going back to the earth. Well, plastic will go back to the earth too. It might just take 1,000 years, but eventually. So maybe you think this isn't that big a deal, right? In which case you might justify this in various kinds of ways. Somebody else will pick it up. Could be a justification. It's okay to throw things out the car window because somebody else will pick it up. It's okay to throw things out the car window because it's only wrong if you get caught. Remember when we talked about deviance, that to do something that's deviant, you have to violate a norm and someone has to label it a norm violation and give you a negative sanction. So if nobody sees you litter, well, technically you have done nothing deviant. How do you think the person in the car feels about this? What do they think about the nature in question? They may feel like it's theirs to trash. They may feel some dominance or control over nature. They may feel disconnected from nature. I think if you litter, you often feel disconnected from nature. You don't feel ownership over it in the sense that it is valuable to you, right? We tend to trash things that we feel are not valuable. So this person may feel some disconnection. After all, they're only driving through it, right? They may not live here. They may just be passing through. You see lots of litter on highways, people just passing through places. What do you think that they think about the plastic bottle itself? They may think it will degrade naturally. Maybe that's one reason why people throw cardboard or paper out. They may think that it will just sort of naturally decompose and that it's okay to throw it out. I'm not sure. But the meanings that we have for the physical world are shaped through our socialization. So there's I'll give you an example. I've got this. You've probably been watching this guy up on the upper right. This is look at his name right, Iron Eyes Cody. There was a famous advertisement in the 1970s, an anti-littering advertisement. It may have been an EPA thing, I can't remember, but it's an anti-littering advertisement. And there's this Native American guy, and someone drives by. I don't know, he's standing on the side of the highway. Don't ask me why he's standing on the side of the highway. I have no idea. This could be a commentary on highways going through Native American lands. I'm not sure. You can interpret it like this. But he watches someone throw something out of a passing car, and it makes him very sad. You can see in the zoom in, he's got a tear drop coming out of his eye. There are a couple things, if you sort of analyze this commercial, this very well-known commercial, you could argue that the message here is that littering is an individual act, right? And it's your or our individual responsibility not to do it. You might also argue that implicit in this commercial is the fact that you should not litter because you are harming other people's land. Perhaps this is an admission that we live ultimately on land that was taken from someone else. And I wonder what other meanings that you might pull from this, but many people were sort of alerted to the ills of littering through this commercial. It was a very effective commercial. It pulls on people's emotions we see this sort of sympathetic figure. But interestingly, this guy, Iron Eyes Cody, is not actually Native American. He's an Italian actor. So that could also be something to analyze here, that this person is just a representation of a Native American. It's not actually a Native American. And that has to do a lot with how we think of nature, right? Oftentimes when we see nature, it's not really nature. It's just our kind of filtered nature. We see it represented back to us in media or something. But this is interesting, right? The meanings that we have for the physical world are shaped through socialization. We can only know about what is available for us to know about. For example, we hear about wildfires and other environmental catastrophes in the United States, in Australia, in other Western or global North. These are sort of like wealthier, developed, industrialized countries like the United States. We hear about these things in global North countries, but we don't hear about environmental problems in poorer global South countries, where environmental and societal damage due to climate change, pollution, and other human agency is far more devastating. Have you ever heard of the Siberian wildfires? I bet you have never heard of the Siberian wildfires. If you have, good for you. You're paying attention to some sort of news, but certainly not the news that 99% of Americans are seeing. Why have people never heard of the Siberian wildfires? Well, because this happens in Russia and nobody lives there. Or rather, we don't really care about the people who live there. If it doesn't happen to humans, it might as well not happen at all. We don't think it affects us, our media doesn't cover it, we see ourselves as disconnected from the global environmental problems, we see ourselves as disconnected from animals, from the ecology there, from the water there. The wildfires in Siberia are a rather annual occurrence. They usually occur from loggers who are illegally logging, and they're covering their tracks, right? They're setting fire to their encampments and things, and it causes giant fires and burns a large part of the Siberian forest. In 2019, I can't remember if this was the year of the giant California wildfires. I know we've had several in the last handful of years. But in 2019, the Siberian wildfires were 32% larger than the California wildfires. They burned 6.4 million acres of land, which is 6.4% of California. California is, what math there be, 164 million acres of land. If you put that in the perspective of Georgia, the Siberian wildfires burned 80% of Georgia. And you've never heard of it. And there are hundreds of examples like this, from the Shell oil spills in the Niger Delta in Nigeria that you have probably also never heard of, that have destroyed the livelihoods of farmers, of tens of thousands of farmers and villages. Destroyed water supplies, wrecked ecosystems. The Alberta tar sands fracking in Canada, or even some of those in our own backyards. So when I was started teaching this environmental sociology class, I learned about something that I had never heard about before, that happens in the mountains in Appalachia, in West Virginia, Kentucky. It's called mountaintop removal coal mining. You can look it up. It's crazy. Where mining companies have figured out ways to extract coal from seams and deposits in mountains, like big mountains, and they go up there and they essentially chop the top of the mountain off, blow it up, the top of the mountain, and then take the coal from it. And they clear cut the whole mountain. This obviously has huge environmental consequences for people who live there, for the ecosystems and animals that are there. You should go look at pictures of this and look and read about how this is done. It's utterly fascinating, but most people I have talked to about this have never heard of this, like I had never heard of this before, and it's just close to us, right? Why have we never heard about these things? This goes back to my point about nature work, right? We can only attach a meaning to the physical world if we have that meaning sort of in our repertoire of cultural meanings to attach to it. If we don't know that something exists, or if we don't know that something happens, we can't have any understanding of it. So we need to know about the problems that exist so we can have some sort of understanding about it. There are many environmental impacts of the digital age. This is my second sort of example here. With the proliferation of the internets, of our digital devices, of everyone owning a smartphone in the last decade or so, higher and higher speed internet, the cloud in recent years, all sorts of other technological advancements that have to do with high-speed internet. You can argue that our economy has converted in many ways to one of attention, right? Where we have to pay attention to things. We have to pay attention to news and information. We are consumers 24/7 of information. We give our attention, right? That's sort of like what we pay into these free things like Facebook. We give our attention to TikTok, and in return, we get entertainment, we get information, we get socialization, we get relationships, we get whatever it is that we get out of it. We are expected to, and we do, we plug into digital communications all the time. We're constantly connected. Increased motivation at the individual level, but also at the business level, at the government level, at the national level. Increased motivation to be connected 24/7 at all levels of society leads to more infrastructure for information and communications technology, leads to skyrocketing demand for rare earth metals, plastics, other materials necessary in manufacturing, the microelectronics to go into your Samsung Galaxies, to go into your MacBooks, to go into your big screen TVs, your video game consoles, your car electronics, everything you can think of. The process of extracting these resources from the earth has led to an ever-expanding surge of devastating mining that poisons soil and groundwater, turns natural environments into dead craters, causes significant harm to the health of wildlife and humans, spurs civil wars in African nations like the Congo and the Central African Republic. And you see how this works by this point, right? Poor countries' resources, the Congo for example, are extracted, their environments destroyed, by transnational corporations that have no national allegiance and don't care about the people there or the land there in as much as they can extract wealth from it. They provide resources for the ever-growing consumption habits of people in affluent societies like ours. So the exploitation of people in the global south leads to people in the affluent global north being able to consume more and more and more, without regard to the conditions and consequences of production and consumption in faraway parts of the world that, with my Siberian wildfire example, the Congo example, you never hear about. So the digital age brings about many environmental impacts, most of which we are able to ignore, right? We are able to ignore. Not everyone is able to ignore these things. But our sort of ability to ignore them leads us to be able to continue on the treadmill, running faster and faster, doing what we are doing, consuming, enjoying a nice quality of life, at the expense of the earth, the environment in other locations, people in other locations, animals, and so on. After we are done with our devices, our Fitbits, our printers, our computers, all these things, they go back to these same global south countries where the resources were originally extracted from for harmful, toxic disposal and recycling at e-waste facilities. I've given you a picture here of one in Thailand. But these facilities offer cheap and dangerous labor, toxic fumes. You can see a couple people wearing masks here to prevent the burning of the lungs. Spiking cancer rates among workers and people living nearby, contaminated land and groundwater, air pollution, and so on and so forth. So why a picture from China? Well, I could have picked many other places in South and Southeast Asia, which is where most of this sort of e-waste processing, recycling happens, and where a lot of our plastic, especially plastic, but also other recyclables and trash gets exported. And by like some of our plastics, I mean like all of our plastics. So one reason that I've got China here as well, that I've got Thailand here as well, is because most of our stuff used to go to China until the really, really recent past, until about 2018. In 2018, China banned the import of foreign e-waste and nearly all other recycling, especially plastic. China used to take about 70% of plastic from the United States and about 95% from the European Union. And starting in 2018, it said, nope, no more. So what happens? Well, we've got to send all of our junk somewhere, all of our plastic, our e-waste somewhere, so it goes to other countries. Thailand is an interesting case, especially to me, because its import of trash and recycling increased 10 times immediately after the Chinese ban. Other countries increased significantly as well, like in Malaysia and Vietnam. So You can see the impact of the treadmill of production here. It accelerates because we exist in a dominant relationship to the natural world and in a dominant relationship to other people in the global south and countries in the global south as well. This is where the environmental movement comes into play, and alternative visions of humans' relationships to nature become really important to think about. So I mentioned that the treadmill of production perspective is a good example of human exceptionalism, right? We're able to be on this treadmill because we're able to dominate and control nature, dominate and control other societies and other people who have fewer resources than we do, right? We get to exploit the commons, is another way to say this. We are exploiting the commons. Other people are really seeing the negative effects of it, but we are seeing more and more of the negative effects over time as well, and we are having to deal with the externalities. So on the left here, I've got two sort of different other sort of alternative models of a societal relationship to the environment. On the left is a sustainability model, so you might say sustainable development. A sustainable development model doesn't prioritize economy, right? The treadmill of production perspective prioritizes economy, straight up. Extract, profit, repeat. The sustainable development model tries to balance people, economy, and nature. So it tries to balance the need for economic growth and the need for an affluent society, right, that exists with disposable income, that can have the things they need, have the things they want, while also prioritizing the well-being of people. That is, our health and well-being is also important. There should be equity, right? There should be environmental justice, prioritizing that sort of stuff. And also, what was that? Who pushed what? Baby. And also, you pushed what?
I don't know.
Minor crisis averted. And also tries to balance nature, right? The needs of the natural world. So we're conserving, right? We're conserving nature, but we're also using nature. We're using nature in a sustainable way. So sustainable development kind of tries to find a nice balance between these three things. And this is really hard though, because usually the winner here, the one that gets prioritized the most here, is economy, and usually the one that gets prioritized the least here is nature. People are, more or less somewhere in between. So these sustainable development models are great, but you have to ask a question about what is sustainable development, and that question is not easy to answer. And if I ask you that question, we can go down a very, very long chain of me probing you about what sustainable development is. It's like, what does it mean to be sustainable? What are we trying to develop? Who benefits the most from the kind of development that we're thinking about? And on and on and on and on. So another alternative here, it's called the new ecological paradigm. This is as opposed to human exceptionalism. The new ecological paradigm says that humans are a part of nature. Humans exist within the natural world. Nature sustains us, and it should not be dominated or exploited. Rather, we should work alongside of it collaboratively to have the things that we want, to have the things that we need, to not take too much, to not destroy it for our own benefit, for our own greed or pursuit of profit or whatever it is. In the right-hand side is what's called the rights of nature model. This is the idea that nature has a right to exist. Nature has a right to be natural, to be nature, to not have us bother with it. And when I say nature, there's a lot of things embedded within that, right? It's the coral reefs, it's the chimpanzees in the jungle, it's like all the little micro insects and things that you never really are aware of, but many of which perform vital functions to support ecosystems, whether it's as food for other animals or whatever it is. It's the trees, it's the water, it's it's everything. We exist in the natural environment, and that's the crux of environmental sociology, that we often don't recognize we exist in a natural environment. We tend to take it for granted. We tend to try and change it to bend it to our will. But in the rights of nature model, this is not the case. This is embedded in the new ecological paradigm, but it puts nature first. Instead of trying to balance nature, people, and the economy, Because like I said, we know who wins that one every time. It's the economy. And we know who loses, and it's usually nature and people. Instead of trying to balance those things, it says nature comes first, right? And then people come second, and then economy comes third. This is obviously counter to dominant thinking in political economy, but this is a different way of thinking about fundamental relationship to nature and to the earth, and is brought about by the problems that we are currently experiencing and that many, many people are currently suffering, and that will continue to increasingly suffer due to human impacts on the environment. Climate change, acidification of oceans, dirtier air, all these sorts of stuff. So the environmentalism, and you can read about this in the book, but you can go way deeper too. Environmentalism spans these things, right? It spans sustainable development on the left. It spans the rights of nature model on the right. All of this is environmentalism, or can be environmentalism. There's not just like one environmentalism. But what all environmentalism has in common is denouncing the treadmill of production. We can do this at home, like recycling more, planting a garden, watching your carbon footprint, but this really individualizes solutions to a social problem, and it essentially blames you for the social problem. So when you are told to go measure your carbon footprint, the idea is that you are doing too much to make too big of an impact on the earth, and you need to stop doing what you're doing to make less of a footprint, less of an impact, less pollution, etc. Well, you and however many other people decide to do that, that's great, but ultimately your carbon footprint and the carbon footprint of a billion other people matter nothing compared to the carbon footprint of industry. And that's part of this sort of rhetoric of having individual carbon footprints, is it takes the pressure off, or the attention away from industry, who is primarily affecting negatively the environment. Industry pollutes far more than all of us combined. So think about all these changes at the macro level. How does industry need to change? How does government need to change? Economy, policies? This raises a million questions. For example, one that I find especially interesting is that given that we, the industrialized Western countries, global North, given that we have largely created, I don't mean you or me, I mean we as in our societies over history and presently to some extent, but given that we have largely created the problems of climate change and pollution since the Industrial Revolution, should we pay to clean up the environment globally? Or should China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and other such developing nations, who are significant polluters now and will be even more so in the future, remember, China and India have the highest populations in the world by a long shot. Indonesia and Brazil are not too far behind. They will both surpass us in the near future. Should they pay for their own pollution? If they pay, though, they have limited resources. China has a good amount, but other countries have limited resources. If they pay, they will experience further resource constraints, and they'll follow the cheapest and dirtiest path to development. So should they be allowed to pollute their way to affluence, just like we did? Or should we restrict their ability to develop like we did, and force them to develop in a more green way that costs more? If it costs more, who should pay? Should we, since we have the resources, subsidize their development so that they will develop cleaner and greener? That benefits the commons, perhaps restores it for all of us. Or should we let them fend for themselves and continue to dominate them? I don't know the answer. You probably have one, but you should think about it. It all comes back to the tragedy of the commons, how we started this lecture. How will we use the resources that we, all 7.8 billion of us, share? How will we ensure that we work with the environment, not against it? How will we collectively act in such a way that the commons becomes resilient and bounces back from all of our plundering and extraction? Or will the commons collapse under the shared weight of our desire for consumption, for material goods and profit? That is a pressing question of environmental sociology. It is no easy task to answer, and it goes along with the first half of this lecture on population, right? The more and more of us there are, the harder it is to all work in the commons collectively. But I will leave you to think about these questions and to read this great T-Rex comic. Until next time, I will see you. Thank you for your attention.